Beat. Okay, so I'm here with Stephen J. Gertz, and what's the name of your book that's just out?
Dope Menace, The Sensational World of Drug Paperbacks.
And then I'm here with Maja.
Maja.
Oh, of course. And how do you spell the last name?
It's Daoust, French Canadian.
And what's your book?
My book is called The Secret Source, and it's basically an addendum or antidote to The Secret that Rhonda Byrne put out.
But how could you write an antidote when a friend of mine, he studied The Secret, he lived The Secret, and then he got to seduce all the beautiful women that he used The Secret for, so...
But at what cost?
To his soul, yes. But I'm so jealous. I mean, you really...
It works. I mean, there's no question about it that voodoo works, but should you do voodoo is really the question. And in the book I give a history of the law of attraction, how it actually goes way back in ancient Egypt and the earliest alchemical manuscripts. And it's a type of voodoo, which is sympathetic magic that, you know, you make an intention and then you do like an act or a thought, and that's basically exactly what voodoo is. But what people don't understand is that it attracts all kinds of things. Like, for example, if you want to attract love, like your friend who attracts beautiful ladies, you'll get love to you and beautiful ladies, but a magnet just attracts metal and it's not discerning. So like you'll get stalkers and rapists and all the, you know, girls who won't leave you alone and then get all psycho, and those will all come to you as well. And they kind of left that whole part out of The Secret about how there is, you know, the flip side to it, that everything isn't positive, that all the positive thoughts also attract negatives.
But isn't like The Secret as American as apple pie?
Yeah, it's total entitlement in American, which is another reason that I ranted about it, is because it's like all this false entitlement just inflates everything, and that's kind of why we have this economic fallout that we're having now, is everyone thinks they're entitled to all this booyaka and they don't take any responsibility for it, and it's all these fake checks that don't exist. And it really, I think she incurred a great deal of bad karma on her soul when she put that book out. So I just wanted to put my book out to try and explain it a little more to people so they didn't, you know, get all into voodoo and not know what they were doing.
Right.
Yeah.
So what's the thesis of your book, Stephen?
Well, essentially that these books, which started flooding the market in the immediate aftermath of World War II, played a major role, if not the major role, in introducing Americans to drugs and drug use for the first time in 2 generations, because the previous drug epidemic in the United States was in the late 19th century, early 20th century. And when those addicts died out, 2 generations went by before the average American had an inkling, an awareness of what drugs were about. These paperbacks sold so well, going into 80 to 100,000 retail outlets across the country, that Americans couldn't help but see these things. They were sold any place that where magazines were sold. And the covers were so dramatic, so sensational and lurid that your eyes would just go to them immediately. You'd pick the books up, and the covers were meant to do that, to attract you, to pick up the book and glue to your emotional centers in the brain so you wouldn't put it back down again. So the generation of Americans after World War II didn't know anything about drugs, and what they learned about drugs, they learned from these paperbacks. But drug use in paperback goes all the way back to the late 19th century, before our current conception of what an addict is had been developed. Back then, a drug addict was as likely to be a middle-class, upstanding woman as anything else. And when drug laws started, particularly the Harrison Act, which didn't actually outlaw drugs, it just controlled them very tightly and made it difficult for people to get them. By the time Harrison Act came out, the middle-class, medically addicted junkies were dying out, leaving only the crimester addicts. Drug use submerged into the underground and out of the eyesight of the average American. In the late 19th century, just like now, everyone knew someone who had a drug problem. Injectable morphine was a great panacea. Doctors were prescribing it for all manner of complaint, and many, many people became addicts through their doctor. And when doctors became more aware of the pernicious effects of morphine, particularly injectable morphine, they stopped prescribing it as much. And the greatest literary example of this phenomenon is Mary Tyrone, the matriarch in Eugene O'Neill's Long Day's Journey into Night. It was based on his mother. Eugene O'Neill's mother was a long-term morphine addict who became addicted while under a doctor's care. But at a certain point, her original disease had disappeared, and what she was left with was this horrible dependence on morphine. So these books are very important, very influential to the post-World War II American, and the claims, the outrageous claims, were so over the top. The anti-drug propaganda was so extreme that what happened during the 60s is that all of us who came of age during the 60s, who were listening to all this crazy propaganda, just totally dismissed it. One of the reasons that the drug culture developed during the 60s was as a complete rejection, not only of parents' philosophy and the status quo, but all the crazy things that have been said about drugs in the past. They were so unbelievable that no one believed anything that anyone said about drugs. And so an entire generation started from scratch and experimented. And these books chronicle the American infatuation with drugs from the late 19th century through 1975, which was pretty much when that second drug epidemic in America ended. Of course, then in the 80s, you've had the third one with cocaine. That's modern. We all know about that stuff. This book covers an era and a literature that most Americans are totally unaware of.
Maja, I'm from Australia, and we have this folk stories about Aborigines and voodoo, that they would point a bone at someone and they would die.
Sure.
Do you have any insight into what might be going on?
Well, almost all voodoo uses some kind of sympathetic magic, and that breaks into two different branches. And there was a great book called The Golden Bough by James Fraser, Sir George James Fraser, I believe his name is. And he breaks it into two different categories, and one is called homeopathic magic, and then one is contagious. So contagious sympathetic magic would be like if I took a little hair from your beard and then I kept it and did something to it, it would, affect you because it was something that was on you. So it would affect you even at a distance. There was actually a whole bunch of different medical things that are based on that, like radionics, where you would send little hair in the mail to this person and they would concentrate the healing energy on your hair and then you get healed because it's like contagious. And then the other one, which is homeopathic, is like treats like. So if they were pointing a bone, probably what was going on in their brain was like that they were going to send disease into your bone through the bone that they were, affecting you with. It usually works on that kind of logic. It's a very logical system of magic.
Does it actually work physically?
I mean, there's lots and lots of literature about people that get affected by voodoo, and some people say that the victim has to believe in voodoo themselves in order for it to work on them, but there's a lot of documented cases of people getting affected by it that had no knowledge of the voodoo working on them. And even in quantum physics, there's a lot of examples of that same thing. Like, there's a very famous quantum physicist named Wolfgang Pauli, and whenever he would go into a laboratory, there was something that they called the Pauli effect. Because whenever he would go in, everything would go haywire, and all the experiments would fail. And it was to such a degree that there was one time that he was on a train passing his friend's laboratory. At the exact moment he was on the train, and it passed by his laboratory, the friend's experiment exploded. And they had corresponded with each other to correlate that was in fact what happened, that he was in that place at that time. And people said that it was just because he had such an amazing energy about him, and that what he felt was true, that none of the other experiments could possibly, happen. But it was just by his presence that he would affect that kind of thing. That would be another example of contagious magic, where just that kind of presence would have an effect.
So do you believe there's validity to that?
I believe that there's a lot of validity to it, and you can do a simple experiment yourself. Like if you want to find out, you don't have to do a harmful act of voodoo.
Yeah.
But like you said with your friend and how he attracted all the ladies, it's very easy to do little experiments. Like you can, now I'll have to think of an example of something that you could do that would not be even just lighting a candle with an intention and then seeing. But time is funny with these things. It doesn't always happen right away. There's often a time like I can give you a good example.